danger lurks in our forests and woodlands on days like this. And no, I'm not talking about Bigfoot meeting you on the trail somewhere and possibly carrying you away. Yes, of course, there are many dangers that threaten us every day, from simple things like cutting our fingers with knives to falling down on the ice and hurting our backs. Now, the situation I'm talking about, as you may have guessed by now, is the fact that we have high winds moving into the area today. Actually, it was windy last night too, but they're going to get a lot heavier today, from 70 to 80 kilometers an hour, which for you folks in the imperial system would equal about up to 50 miles an hour or so. And I know for a lot of you that are living in hurricane and tornado prone areas, that doesn't seem like much, but we don't get high winds much above 80 or 280 that often. Now, of course, the problem with high winds when you're walking in woodlands and forests is the potential to have tree branches and limbs break from high above you and fall down upon you. And this can cause serious injury or death, and it often does result in death. As you can see here, this section of our forest has a lot of dying and already fallen down beech trees, American beech trees, unfortunately, because of the beech bark disease that's going throughout North America. And so when these trees die or start to die, typically you get twigs and small branches breaking off from high above first, and then as the trees become more and more declined, larger branches start to fall off and portions of the trunk, and eventually the whole tree falls over. And if you're in the woods during these times of high winds, they pose a significant threat to anything on the ground. Right now I'm out with the dogs on our morning dog walk, and I just thought I'd come up into the woods to talk about this today. As I mentioned, it's windy out, but the biggest winds are probably coming in a few hours, I think, from the forecasts. There are some pretty strong gusts already, so I'm trying to be very careful about where I'm walking and listening for excessive wind or anything breaking above, just in case, but I'm hoping I can get through this before the winds get too strong. Now, of course, it doesn't take much to do harm if you're hit by falling debris. A small twig can knock you in the head fairly strongly if it's coming from 70 or 80 feet high, and certainly small branches would cause a little more pain. But I've frequently found out here, and I'll keep my eyes open for one today as I go along, but I've frequently found branches that have broken off from high up, I guess, and come down in a vertical fashion and driven themselves into the ground anywhere from a couple inches to a foot, depending on the size of the branch. Obviously, the heavier they are, they come down with more force, but it's amazing how far they can penetrate the ground. So you can imagine what that would do to your head. If that hit your head, it would be game over for sure. And unfortunately, a lot of people that work in the woods have met their demise in that fashion. Now, here's a tree that snapped a couple years ago, and I actually cut some firewood off it last year. You can see here the trunk just snapped right in half and twisted as it fell, and it's all split apart here. Obviously, it had some rod in it up here, and that caused it to collapse. And then it lays down here, and I got the wood off that I could without having too many issues. One situation I remember well was back in the early 90s. I was down in Costa Rica with some friends and relatives on a 2-week expedition through the country looking for wildlife of all types. Anyhow, we were up in the northwest corner camping at Santa Rosa National Park, which is one of the dry scrub forests areas that they have in Costa Rica. And during our whole stay there for about 3 days, the winds were just howling at anywhere probably from 60, 70 kilometers an hour to 80 to 100 kilometers an hour or so, I would say, because they were just howling the whole time. And I've never been in a situation where I've experienced constant, constant winds like that for such a long period of time. And it actually made me feel like I was going crazy after a while, just constantly hearing that drone and whine in the trees and having tree branches swaying back and forth constantly. Anyhow, one night we were all camping in this little campground there, and one night with the heavy winds, I guess a branch broke on one of the local trees, and people often camp under the trees because they're these big spreading Guanacaste trees. That's what the area is named for, Guanacaste province. And they're usually very strong trees with big long spreading limbs that stretch out. They're usually open grown trees, and people would typically camp under them to get the shade in the daytime. But anyhow, this one night a branch broke and fell on a tent nearby, and if I remember right, one of the people had an injured leg, fairly severely injured. So you have to be careful when you're out camping, especially. Now, not a lot of people are out camping up here right now, but if you're in a warmer area, there's probably people camping. And that's one thing I always watch for, is what kind of trees am I camping under, if I'm camping under any trees at all. If I have a preference, I'll stay away from being camped under trees, but sometimes you don't have a choice. In that case, you just have to try and get yourself located away from any decrepit looking trees, or the more likely trees that might fall or break. So as I've already discussed, the most likely trees to crack and break and fall are the half dead or dying trees. But even living trees can fall down and break if you get strong enough winds. And another way they fall down is through uprooting. So here's a tree that's been uprooted and has fallen over and wedged itself between the forks of a yellow birch over there. And Bandit's down here eating something. I don't know. Oh, you're eating poop of some kind. I don't know what it is. Rabbit poop. Why do you do that? We just had you wormed. Come on, out of there. Anyhow, this shows the roots of this tree, which looks like a red maple, I think, having collapsed or being pulled right out of the ground, likely with high winds. And this happens more so where you have really loose soils, like sandy soils or heavily saturated soils. And here we do have quite sandy soils, and out in the woods here they're fairly loamy sands, but fairly loose, I guess I'd describe them, compared to more solid clay soils, or where trees are growing on denser soils with maybe rock underneath, where their roots can really grab a hold. So that's another way trees fall. So that's another way trees fall and can possibly cause threats to you out there in the woods. Here's a hemlock that died and has fallen across our trail and is wedged up on another dead tree. I've just left it there for now because I didn't want to get into trying to hack it down and possibly having it fall on top of me. It seems to be pretty solid. Now after today, I may come back and find that it's fallen if we get strong enough winds. Now this is a spruce plantation that we have along the west edge of our property. I assume it was planted, but it's quite irregular looking, so I'm not sure. But there's a lot of deadfall in here if you walk through it. Some places you can hardly walk through because so many trees have fallen over. And part of that relates to the fact that the trees are so densely packed here. They're not really growing in a healthy fashion. They're growing high and quick to find the sun as quickly as they can when they're young. And they get tall and spindly, and they don't have a lot of lower strength to their trunks. So they eventually reach a certain height, and then when you get really strong winds, they break and fall over. And that's what we've got here. Lots of deadfall through this spruce plantation area. And many of our pine plantations that we have on the property are like this too, because they weren't properly thinned. through the years as they should have been, which basically opens up the area so the remaining trees can get more light and broaden out and become stronger. So in addition to the state of the trees, you also have to think about the type of tree you're dealing with. So in a typical mixed forest like this one, certain trees are a little more prone to breaking and falling down, usually because they're of softer wood types. So softwood trees typically would be a little more prone to breaking than hardwood trees. So some examples of softwood trees around here would include aspen and some of the birch and soft maples, things like that. Whereas the hardwoods would be maples like sugar maple, oak, white oak, red oak. Now white pine, which we have a lot of in this forest and around the property, is a very soft wood. If you've ever cut it, you'll know how soft it is. Now it does have a lot of flexibility, and the same can be said to some degree about the aspens as well. And we also have cottonwoods in our sand pit, and they are very flexible. They have soft wood, but they're very flexible. So in some ways they're fairly resistant to high winds, but there's always that point where they will break. They'll just snap, and with white pines especially, if you're ever cutting branches off of a white pine, you'll know what I'm talking about. You just start cutting, and maybe when you get halfway through, the branch will just snap right off all of a sudden. So they have this breaking point which they can't go beyond, and then they'll just snap. And you see that a lot in ice storms too. If you get a certain amount of ice on the branches, they'll start bending over. Especially in white pines, you see this. They'll just start arching over, bending, 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 and then if you get enough ice, bang, they just snap. And we've had experiences here, and I'm sure many of you have encountered the same thing, where if you get significant ice buildup, you'll just hear things like gunshots out in the woods. And what it is are big white pines just snapping, big limbs snapping off as the weight becomes just too much for them to hold on. The trees are starting to dance above my head. I think the winds are picking up. We have a few rows of red pine planted along the west side of the property. Apparently these were planted back in the 50s. And as you can see, they're quite tall, probably 70 or 80 feet. And again, these weren't really thinned out to the point where they should have been, so they're kind of tall and spindly. They're not too bad. But as you can see right up here, one has fallen over due to the high wind that comes off of this more open area to the west of our property. This area gets very high winds when we get the winds from the west. But you can see this one, it's just up there and leaning against one of the other trees. And today would be a good candidate for a day where that might potentially fall if it gets windy enough, and you don't want to be under there when it falls. She's getting pretty windy now. Right up ahead of me here, there's a good example of an old dead tree full of woodpecker holes. Now this one has largely broken down and collapsed, but there's still some there that could come down on a day like this. You can see the pines up here. I really should get out of this area because this is a more likely area where things may come down eventually. Whoa, getting pretty strong. I better get out of here. Yeah, I think we're getting some gusts up in the 60 and 70 kilometer an hour range now. It's not constant, but we're getting fairly frequent gusts. Here's a large white pine that snapped off some time ago. You can see the size of it here. Big tree, created quite an opening when it fell. It probably took out a lot of the small trees. We have quite a few large hemlock on the property, and they tend to be pretty strong in high winds, even though they have a huge crown of needles that can catch the wind. But there are a number of them in the forest that have died and are falling apart, and those are ones that will more likely crash down in high winds. And again, very heavy trees. Not that any tree wouldn't do significant damage if it fell on you, but... And here's one of our large fallen hemlocks going across the trail here. I just had my first little twig come down and hit me in the arm. Just a tiny little thing, so no big problem. The big white pine that you can see there at the back on the left, a few years ago there was a secondary trunk, and it still goes up most of that height, but the top 20 or so feet broke off in a high wind storm like we may get today. It's quite a tall, spindly white pine with two trunks, but the top of the second trunk on the left broke off, and that was a fairly significant break, over a foot in diameter. It's after lunch now, and the winds have really picked up. You may be able to hear them howling in the background here as I approach the horse field. I'll just turn the camera around. Yeah, she's really blowing out here now. At least 80 kilometers, maybe more. We're on the sheltered west side of the horse field now, with the forest on our west side. And you can just hear the wind roaring through the tops of the trees over there. We're fairly calm down where we are because there's a valley here with a hill on the other side, so that's protecting us too. But it's interesting to hear that roaring sound of the wind in the branches on the other side. You can hear the gusts approaching. They sound like a train coming. And then they go by, and then it calms down for a little while. And then you'll start to hear a distant train again, getting louder and louder, and then another big gust comes. Here's one small branch that's come down. I've seen a few smaller ones than this already. This is about 4:30 in the afternoon now, and the high winds are still going. I have a feeling a lot of this stuff here is new. I don't remember seeing that before here, and you can see the greenery from the hemlock above too. Lots of it scattered down here. So the heavy winds have certainly arrived, as you can see behind me and during the end of this walk. So just a reminder that when you have heavy winds brewing overhead, be careful if you're walking out in the woods or forests, wherever you live.